We want to continue to talk about this major story and maybe what the timeline could look like for the Department of Justice. So let's bring in right now John Day, criminal defense attorney, to help really navigate towards what the DOJ could be coming up with next as far as a timeline for refiling. What is the timeline that we're looking at right now? We already heard from White House officials that they plan, and the DOJ to plan to look at this once again.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, that's right. There's an immediate appeal going on. The Trump Department of Justice has said they're going to take this up on appeal. They want to ultimately get it to the U.S. Supreme Court. I think that's probably the plan, obviously. Again, so they're moving quickly to file the appeal. They want this to maintain this prosecution. You know, of course, this isn't a decision on the merits. It's a decision on the technicality. It's a pretty big technicality, though, on the legitimacy of the appointment of the prosecutor. And the judge in this case, in these cases, actually referenced the reasoning and language of Judge Eileen Cannon's decision in the Jack Smith prosecution of President Trump in the classified documents case, saying that he was not confirmed by the Senate, so that prosecution was not legitimate also. So, you know, we're seeing two sides of the same coin being used, one of them in favor of the Trump Department of Justice and one being used against him. So ultimately, it is going to go to the Supreme Court. It's pretty clear, and they're going to have to make a decision on the breadth and the extent of the power of the executive over essentially the judiciary.
Is there any buffers in our legal system where it would prevent filings like this right off the bat instead of having a court saying, hey, this prosecutor was not qualified?
Well, you know, generally they're internal. And what we saw in these cases, especially the Comey case, was career Department of Justice prosecutors declining to participate. Some people have lost their jobs. There's been sort of an internal reaction to the idea of bringing in Lindsay Halligan to prosecute Comey, prosecute James cases, because they don't sit well with the career prosecutors who say these are sloppy cases. They're bad. The motivation is not pure. Look, I'm an old prosecutor, and you know, prosecutors, the good prosecutors, do not want to take on cases that are motivated by politics. And if in this particular case, that was something that ran through the existing line of prosecutors. Nobody wanted to take this on. They had to bring in someone who had literally never done a day of prosecution in her life. Prosecuting is not like any other type of law. You can't just switch from being an insurance defense lawyer to being a good, competent, ethical federal prosecutor overnight. I mean, there's a long history that you have to develop to understand the grand jury process, to understand the ethics of prosecution. So this case really highlighted that, but I think we're going to get to see a test of it real soon, the Court of Appeals and ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court.
And for that timeline, for appeals, how much time are we looking at here?
I think the turnaround is going to be very, very quick. Obviously, from the White House, we've heard that, you know, they're probably filing, you know, instantly, probably tonight, tomorrow. They want to have this heard, and they want the Supreme Court, which of course has been shown to be relatively favorable in its rulings to the Trump Department of Justice. And it's going to be fascinating to see where they come down on this, because it's the concept of, well, these prosecutors have to be confirmed by the Senate. It's one thing to have an interim prosecutor. The key issue here was the Department of Justice had an interim prosecutor. That timeline expired. Then they brought in Lindsay Halligan. And the issue simply, it's not the merits of the case, but it's simply who is allowed to prosecute and under what circumstances.
And lastly, if it does go to the Supreme Court and it is favorable for President Trump and the DOJ, does Halligan continue the case, or does this political, like, hot potato go to someone else?
Well, the interesting thing in the decision today, it seemed like the judge was saying another prosecutor could take this on. The question is going to be, of course, statute of limitations issues, because at least in the James Comey case, the statute ran in September. So can they and it was filed basically at the last minute. So they preserved the timeline. But if the case is dismissed as it was today, another issue the court's going to have to decide is, can they refile this? In other words, even if the time has run, is it legitimate to refile this case? And is that going to survive a challenge to the statute of limitations? So a lot of interesting issues from a lawyer's standpoint that still remain to be seen.
Yeah, no doubt about that. John, thanks so much for joining us. Great insight as always. We appreciate it right here on Live Now from Fox.
Thanks for having me.